Welcome to the podcast. This is Inside Electronic Music. I'm Eric Turner, your host. And with me today, a good friend of mine who has written a couple of fantastic books. We have The Mental Game of Electronic Music Production, How to Finish Songs Fast and Beat Procrastination. And then his newer book, which is The Process for Electronic Music Production. That is the path to finishing release quality songs consistently. Very happy to have with me today my good friend, Jason Timothy. Welcome, Jason. Good to have
Hey,
you.
Eric.
Good to have you.
Always great to be here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's do this.
it's nice to catch up, although we live not too far from each other, but we don't get a chance to catch up enough. So this is great.
Yep.
So first of all, we've talked a lot offline about how we got musically to where we are today, and just wanted to hear
Yeah.
a little bit about your music history and what you've done in music over the course of your life.
Yeah, sure. So might as well just start from the beginning so that people really get an idea of how this stuff really starts.
Right.
Because most of the people that I run into that are doing the best work are not people that anyone thought were particularly gifted before they started. And that was me as well. I had no particular gift for music. It was just more of I loved listening to it. Period. I was just a fan of music, especially as the '80s came. I'm aging myself a little bit, but as the '80s came and music became more visual, it's like seeing a lifestyle that I wanted to tap into. And it had nothing to do with whether I thought I had the ability to do it. It's just, I want to get VIP into that room. And so it just, from there, it was just about picking an instrument that one of your other buddies wasn't playing. And luckily, we all started with zero talent or zero knowledge and, made little four chord ideas.
Yeah. What instrument?
So it's funny. I'm really glad that I didn't go into what I wanted to. Originally, I wanted to be a drummer and I would have been a terrible drummer. And then I wanted to be a keyboardist, but my buddy got a keyboard and my dad, he was a guitarist. So I don't have a keyboard, but you can have this. He gave me a great guitar. He said, when you learn a few chords, I'll give you an amp. And yeah, it just started from there. The very first time I played was like at a school talent show, and doing something very simple got such a dramatic response to a few hundred people that I thought, yeah, even if I'm not good at this is what I want to do. This is what I want to feel. And I was really slow to learning, but I think I had good ideas. Luckily, the things that inspired me were generally fairly simple.
Mhm.
I wasn't like into progressive metal or something that required a lot of talent. I was just into simple melody songs. So, yeah, just pulled that together and did a lot of the same thing because I had a very limited vocabulary
Mhm.
when I started. And it was just a matter of playing shows and having a lot of enthusiasm.
And what kind of
And
music
you
were you guys
learn it.
playing? What was the style?
It was like new wavy
Mhm.
sort of stuff. Yeah, yeah. I don't know, I think we really liked bands like Depeche Mode and Blamage and Duran, and we were getting into The Cure a little bit in the early time. That would influence us more later and take us from the new wave thing into our gothy phase.
Mhm.
But yeah, it was literally a progression of just a few years of playing shows and being lucky enough that we didn't hear a lot of the negative feedback that probably we deserved in the beginning.
There's
I
times
think
where
the
you're
thing
thankful there wasn't social media back then, so you could hear
Yeah, but yeah, in a lot
everybody
of
ripping
ways,
on things
for
that you did.
us to give it up and that we were terrible, and we probably would not have ever gotten to a point of proficiency. So, yeah, so a good amount of that, and then we just started having goals. The first thing with our band is we saw another band from our school that had played a real venue. It wasn't a great place. It was this place called the Green Door, and that was like the first time that I was like, "Shoot, if they can play a real show that's not a talent show, maybe we can." And then the first show is you think you're gonna sell the place out as some 18-year-old snot, and 12 people show up, and that includes your parents and a couple friends and family, and the promoter asks what the hell happened. But then we progressed, and pretty shortly after, we went to having 100 people and then 300 people. And then I was in California at the time. We got lucky enough to play the Roxy in Hollywood, which was like some big deal to us. And by that time, as an opening band, we sold it out. I think it was a combination of having the right attitude, having the right look, and having interesting music. But literally, there was no gatekeepers
Right.
at the time.
Mm.
I think the thing that we've lost a little bit of now is in the past, there's such a wide variation of what could be played on the radio that no matter what style you were into, you had as much chance as anyone else of getting on the radio.
Think
Not
that
that we ever time, but
Do you think that's because I was having a conversation with somebody recently. We were talking similar thing about gatekeeping and how in the old days there was a variety of what could be on the radio, but there were certain people who decided what went on the radio. And with today,
yeah.
you have things like YouTube and DistroKid and things like that. So they're in a sense, the gatekeepers are gone, but in a sense, they're more there. For the bigger things, they're more there. But for the masses, it's been democratized that anybody can put stuff
Oh,
out
there's
there.
there's gonna be fewer rock stars in
Right.
this era.
Exactly.
It's just not the budget for superstar things. There can be superstar bands still, but they're not gonna be given the budget. So a lot of these potentially great bands might not reach their full potential, but the entry point is really there's no barrier to entering
Right.
the game. It's just you're entering the game with a lot more people and a lot fewer avenues for you to get heard in this whole mess
Right. A lot
of,
more
you know,
competition for the
a lot
a
more
lot more
competition, a
noise.
lot more difficult to get, in back in the day, um, you had to get attention in one way or another, but there were a lot less people in bands, it seemed to me, and, you make a few thousand flyers, and if you're willing to just go and hand those things out and talk to people and be really enthusiastic about what you're doing, um, you'll get people paying attention.
Yeah, and
And I think
you
so.
guys eventually made some music as well, got things released and did you get a record deal or was it releasing on your own or
So, yeah, okay, we're going way far back. The first band, we did end up getting signed to a label in Santa Barbara, California, and they had released, like, some hip hop, pop music stuff and got, like, a top 40 hit. I think they had a song called "Boom, I Got Your Boyfriend" or something like that. But that was their thing, and we got as far as getting the stuff mastered, and because we self-released it first, we made a bunch of cassettes, and the
Mhm.
cassettes were doing well, and the shows were getting more popular. Just a sec, I gotta decline this call. So, yeah, getting the record deal just seemed natural. I think the label just saw us as already well put together. But being young and, that stuff, we got ourselves kicked off the label pretty quick. After we got our first pressings, we never actually made the full release on the label because we were spending the label's money making back in those days, it cost a lot of money to make long distance calls and try to promote yourself and do all these things. And we were just irresponsible and they didn't like that. And so we went on to basically just self promote ourselves, do that sort of thing. And then later with the second band, I came with a much more professional attitude and we ended up doing the promotion thing. We never got
Mm.
signed, but we were considered in Musician Magazine one of the top 100 bands in the country that were unsigned, which is really cool.
Mhm.
We won a radio contest through all of Southern California. I think there were like 1,400 entries. And of those, you get 4 finalists that play like a showcase
Got it.
together. We played the showcase and we won the showcase. So we went from we had one of the guys in my first band was our manager in the second band, and he was an amazing manager. He would interact with the radio station. They just would throw our CDs across the room. They just wouldn't listen to it for ages. He just kept coming back. And finally, someone listened to it and they played it. So it's really ironic that the same station that refused to play us we ended up the number one local band on the station. And even though we only had 6 songs on our EP, every one of those songs was played on the radio by almost every DJ on the station. So that was really cool.
That's awesome.
Um,
How did you go from the band world to being more in the electronic world?
so that takes us to around 96 when I put down the guitar. It was funny. Our drummer, who was the least electronic influenced guy, he was more like he was like a secret, not so secret Van Halen fan in an alternative band. But he showed up in his truck and he said, "I just got this CD from a friend," and sat in his car and listened to it, and it was the first Chemical Brothers album, and I just was floored. And I'd always been into electronic music, always been into keyboards, and in those bands, we until the last part of the band I was talking about, we always used drum machines and
Mhm.
keyboards and things like that. And I was the one, after the first band, I took over keyboard things. So I was playing guitar and doing all the drum programming and the keyboards. So I was getting more and more influenced by electronic music and Britpop and things like that. But once I heard Chemical Brothers and then I picked up Orbital album and Prodigy, I was totally okay when the band broke up because I was already ready to set that down and start making fully electronic music. And I started off really into like big beat sort of stuff, breaksy stuff. That was the Fatboy Slim and Chemical Brothers and Prodigy were all a little more breaksy. There's another band called the Propeller Heads
Mhm.
that were great. They're famous for having a track on the first Matrix movie.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, so that's what I decided to do, and it started off as a project called Nick Shifter, which I talked another buddy into joining me, and we made music together. And back then they had 3.com,
Mhm.
and people streamed your songs enough, you would get paid, and there were charts and everything. So we would try to
Imagine
get
that, getting
ourselves.
paid for streaming.
I know, right?
Crazy.
Yeah. It was really an interesting time. That was probably around, I don't know, 97,
Mhm.
98, something like that, like still in the 90s. And then it developed. I went from being a breaksy guy, and then I saw some DJs and eventually caught a John Digweed show, and it just changed my whole thought process.
Mhm.
Trance music came first, and I was trying to emulate that. And I thought I was failing because all my attempts at trance music were sounding like house music. And now I look back and I'm like, that was my personality
Right.
apparently, and there was nothing wrong with that. Sometimes when you're attempting to do something, there's something in you that wants to get out or wants to create in a certain way.
That's
And
funny.
that move
Just real quick on that. It's funny because I talk to my coaching students a lot, and one of the things that they always ask is they're always looking for advice on how to come up with a signature sound. I think that happens. It happens a lot more naturally than people think as soon as you stop trying to come up with a sound, because you have your own taste, you have your own
exactly.
skill level, you have certain things you're better at than others, you have certain
Yep.
sounds that are more interesting to you than others, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you have a signature sound. That's your thing.
Yeah. I tell people that you won't notice your own originality with your first few songs.
Totally.
It's after you've finished 10, 20 songs and you have a body of work where you can look and almost find the consistency in the sound. Where when you begin, you're only hearing your influences.
Yep.
But when you connect the dots, your music has influences from a lot more artists.
Right.
But the parts that pick that really turns you on is usually going to be consistent
Right.
through your body of work.
And sometimes
And
that's even a piece of gear that you'll be like, "Oh, I love the sound of this." So you use it all the time, and that sound in your productions or your performances becomes that signature thing of yours. I was talking to somebody recently, and we were talking about how gear influenced entire sounds of genres at certain eras. Like, you think about iconic gear like 808s and 909s and things like that that had a huge impact. But then when you think like in the house music world, think about how many of the greatest house music tunes ever wouldn't sound like they do if it wasn't for the Korg M1. Because
yeah,
that
absolutely.
instrument
Yeah.
and the presets in that instrument, that you flip through those presets and it's, "Oh, there's Homeless. Oh, there's Show Me Love. Oh, there's whatever," and you just tick them
Yep.
off because of a particular piece of gear and or something you heard or something you were into, some influence that you had.
So I think that there's this balance. Like, I'll get to the electronic aspect of this,
Mhm.
but I want to back up to the idea that, yeah, you can create your signature sound with certain instruments that you gravitate towards. And I think that one of the mistakes that a lot of producers or aspiring producers make in the beginning is they think that every song they make has to be a whole reinvention. and every sound needs to be something totally new. And it's like, what you really want to do is look at music the way bands did. When you started a band, your drummer had one drum kit. Those were the sounds. That was going to be the sounds of all your music. You had one or two guitars and one amp, maybe two amps if there was like something special you wanted to do. But it's a very limited sort of thing. And then if you're like a guy like me, you get a few guitar pedals that fit your sound or whatever. The bass player usually has one or two basses and an amp. So that's your sound. And with
Mhm.
electronic music, there's so many choices that people are afraid to find something that is their sound you could repeat. When I had
Yep.
my most productive electronic music phases, I used pretty much the same or a variation of maybe three different bass sounds
Right.
through all that music. You know what I mean? Because it took me a long time to dial something in that sounded right to my ears to become like something that I felt really good about.
Mhm.
You know, it doesn't make sense for me to reinvent that. Why not capitalize that? And as you progress, you're able to make that sound a little bit better because these little tweaks that you make, you discover, oh, I just discovered a way to make this signature sound of mine even a little bit
Mhm.
better. Whereas if you're doing something with a whole new palette every single time, it's like being an artist and one day you paint a horse and the other day you paint a basket of fruit and the next day you paint a rainbow.
Mhm.
The next day you paint a train. So you're an amateur at all of those. You never dive deep enough to really understand the subtleties of the things that you're doing.
I think
Yeah, I
you
think
talk about like influences and what makes people want to do certain sounds. I feel like that has an impact in what you're talking about as well, because in the old days, you sound like the old guys here for a second. In the
yeah,
old
totally,
days,
right?
music was listened to on a song by song basis. Then you started, especially in the electronic world, it became all about DJ sets. And when you listen
Yeah,
to a
listen
DJ
to
set, like you
something
listen to
well,
John Digweed, when you're listening to John Digweed or Carl Cox or any like great classic DJ, every track that they're playing was likely produced by a different producer. So each track sounds different and unique from the last one, and they're weaving them together into their sound as a DJ, as a selector. But every track sounds different. So producers get out there and they say, hey, the stuff I'm listening to, every track has a different kick. So I need 300 different kick drums in my arsenal. And every bass sounds different and
mm,
every hi-hat sounds different. When in reality, it's funny you use the band example because I use that all the time with my students. I always say, like, when the Rolling Stones would play a concert, they wouldn't change out the kick drum between tracks. Like they had
right.
one kick
Yeah,
drum and
exactly,
that
right.
was the sound of their album. It was the sound of their tour. It was the sound of everything. And when you listen to electronic music, when you listen to really great electronic music by a particular artist, you will hear those through threads. But when you're not
Yeah,
listening deep into one artist and you're listening shallowly into DJ sets, you're only going to hear a track or two from each of those artists. So you get the impression that everything has to sound different. And it
I
have
have
to
a
sound
slightly different
different, you know?
I have a slightly different take on that. I think the end result is where we're both at. I look at a great DJ mix as a study
Mhm.
of genre.
Yeah.
Sure, you DJ set has an arc, right? But a good DJ set gives you the impression you walk away and go, "That was a really dark set," or "That
Mhm.
was really an epic thing," or "That was really a hypnotic thing," or a psychedelic thing. And when you're into that thing, then you can find the commonalities.
Right.
It's it's not too often that you're gonna hear a DJ mix that has no commonalities throughout the arc of music, because the way that things can need to blend together
Mhm.
typically are gonna require some similarities and then evolution. So the kicks might get brighter towards the end. So then you understand, okay, great. Do I wanna make opening set type of music, or do I wanna make closing set type of music? And you get to see the arc of how that develops. And so it in a way, even though it's not a deep dive on a particular artist, I think it is a little bit of a deep dive of someone who's a really great curator telling you this is after exploring thousands of songs, this collection of songs makes sense
Yep.
for the
And
sake.
I think we're saying, I think I totally agree with what you're saying there. And I think that as the DJ, I think I would say looking at it like that and coming up with those, what is the arc? What are the similarities? How do I use these tracks as the tools to move from one mood to another throughout a set? And I think that's part of what I think is missing a little bit as time goes on, is that as an aspiring producer, I think producers aren't doing the deep dive into what was this. And like you just mentioned a minute ago, am I going to produce opening music? Am I going to produce peak time music? And I think that a lot of times they're looking at it saying, I want to make it all at the same time. So everything has to sound different from one another. And they
That's
lose themselves in trying to be all things to all people. They
and when
become
you
nothing
do
for
that,
anybody at that point.
I think because when you do that, there's an essence in the music. And I think people can tell when you're not confident in your sound.
Mhm.
Who's confident in their sound. Take a band like the Ramones, right? Clearly, they're not trying to change anything. You know what you're getting,
Mhm.
and you either dig it or you don't. But it gives people the opportunity to make their choice on you're either on board or you're not. If they were trying to be everything to everyone, then it'd be so eclectic that you didn't know what they really
You have
were.
nothing.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like if you show up with a different personality every time you go out.
Right.
You're playing a different part, and people are like, where's the real you in all of this, right? The commonality is what allows people to feel like they get you.
Right. Do you think that, I don't have to make up a word here, like the playlistification of music has had an impact on this? When you think about people making deep dives into an individual artist by
Okay.
putting on an album, whether it's a record or a CD or a cassette or whatever the format was back when that was the way we listened to music. And now most music is being consumed on playlists and digitally. So they're listening to
Right.
a couple seconds and making a decision. Do I like it? Do I not like it? If I don't, skip until it's something that I either know or that catches my ear and resonates with me in that moment. And they haven't given really the chance for that deeper dive into a longer format of an artist, whether it's a whole song or, far
Mhm.
be it forbid in this day and age, a whole album from one artist start to finish.
Okay, great. Um, I get what you're saying. You're saying not many people are taking the time to hear a body of work.
Mhm. Impacts the way
And
people make the work because
and
they're
in
gearing towards that.
creation, right. So there's a couple things like I think the best artists are the ones that in the past they were rewarded for just saying fuck all that. We're going to do our own
Right.
thing. You know, now there are still people with that attitude, and those tend to be the artists that I like
Mhm.
best. But you're playing a game. A lot of artists now are playing a game to please the robots that will please the people.
Right.
It's like the go between. We're not going directly to humans anymore. We're going to an algorithm like, oh, the first 3 seconds of my song isn't interesting enough.
Right.
Some of my favorite songs don't really even kick off for 2 minutes.
Right.
You know? And then don't even get me started on a DJ mix. Some DJ mixes can go for 15 minutes before it really starts. I like to be pulled into an environment, but yeah, there's music that needs to bang you on the head. I used to consider like rock and roll music, beer music that
Mhm.
had to punch you in the face. And the slow builds and the evolving sounds was almost more psychedelic music
Mhm.
where people a different part of the brain was stimulated.
Right.
And oftentimes people don't graduate above the and this is not a promotion for drugs, kids, but they don't graduate above the punch you in the face beer drinking attitude until they've had some sort of either meditative or psychedelic
Mhm.
experience. And all of a sudden they can hear the subtlety and get the full enjoyment and almost the purpose of what the song's doing, instead of something that's just trying to give you 1, 2 punches through the whole thing. And I think now with this whole content creation algorithm thing, everything is going back a little bit to beer drinking music, something
Mhm.
simple
Yep.
for the common man. And I think more artists need to, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love my share of that kind of music as well.
Mhm.
But I think we need to go back to the customer is not always right. And they don't know what the hell they want until they've heard it.
Mhm.
And if you're trying to please an algorithm that only responds to something that it's heard before to know whether it's good enough to share with the world, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, for sure. I think then that you touched on there that I not sure gets talked about enough is different genres, subgenres of music being more appropriate for different contexts, right? And
Yeah,
I always
sure.
think, whenever I talk about the difference between like more commercial kind of EDM or top 40 kind of music versus something that's more underground techno, for me, it's not about good versus bad or cheap versus difficult or whatever. For me, it's about context. And if you think about like you look at the popularity of more commercial music in the electronic world in the United States versus Europe. And you look at the popularity of more underground music in Europe versus the United States on a broader scale.
Sure.
A lot of it comes down to context. Like here, most of the time, if you're hearing dance music, you're hearing it in a club here in the US where the club, nobody goes before 11:30. The club closes at 2, so last call is at 1:30. So you've got 2 hours to hear a bunch of songs, do some shots, meet somebody. You got to cram your whole thing into this short time context. So the music has to be faster and shorter and catchy and get to you and big builds and big drops and all that stuff. Where if you're in a context of
In concert, yeah.
where we see like in after hours here, but in Europe, it's in normal clubs where the idea is I'm going to this club for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, and the music
Right.
is going to be the soundtrack of an evening. And I'm not trying to cram everything in. That's where I see you look at these genres and you'll see that the more underground kind of hypnotic techno styles tend to be much more music of patience because of the context where it's listened to. People are hearing it in a place where they're going, they don't mind if a track is 10 minutes long. They don't mind if a breakdown is 3 minutes long. Where at a club
Yeah, sure.
here, it's come on, get to it, play my favorite song.
I mean, no one would listen to Brian if it wasn't presented in the right
Totally.
context. Ambient sound, no drums, who would think?
Right.
No real
Is
structure.
that even like, come on, if there's no drums?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I completely agree that context is everything. It reminds me of the concert violinist that's celebrated and plays in big arenas. He shows up in a subway where no one knows who he is, and
Right.
everyone just they hear the same beauty, but they just ignore it.
Mhm.
It's just it's not front ground because of the context. It's a really interesting psychological experiment, really.
Yep.
Um,
Speaking of
I think
psychological
that
experiments, I'm curious about your books. I would love to talk about them for a minute if we can.
yeah, I'd be happy to share some of that with you, and some of what I'm speaking was it bubbles in from my experiences of writing these books, and obviously having the experience making the music, and being on both sides of the spectrum, making music, coaching, and that sort of thing.
Context,
Last thing I'll
oh, yeah, go for it. Sorry. Go ahead.
last thing I'll touch on is that I think that there's this thing now where a lot of artists have to make a choice whether they want to be popular or whether they want to be authentic. And that's a sad choice that artists are having to make. I think that the idea of pop music now is generally a continuation of the same music that slowly evolves. And the only thing that really gets better, in my opinion, is the production. They're finding a better way to produce that same kick drum that works all the time, that same bass sound that works all the time, that same sort of melody that works all the time.
Mhm.
All of those pieces are already there, and we've lost the beauty of not listening to music for strictly production value, you know? And another thing that I would say before getting onto the book
Mhm.
is that you were comparing US market to a European market. And I think part of that has to do with Americans are a little bit afraid of their own opinion in some way. And what I mean by that is most Americans are looking for something that already has an approval rating.
Mhm.
So we're always looking for the winners in general in the
Right.
States. What's popular, what's accepted.
Of the winning team.
Yeah. Whereas in Europe, let's just take soccer, for example. If you're born in a certain city, that's your team, whether they win or lose. You don't jump ship, sort of thing. So there's a little bit more of this idea of rooting for the underdog
Mhm.
sort of thing. And rooting for maybe the less perfectly produced, but the art that has the most heart in it.
Mhm.
What I think the difference seems to be for me, and I think as we're progressing into modern times and digital times, the winners keep winning and the underdogs are having a little bit of a harder time creating a living from that.
Yeah, do you see, just thinking on that idea of the like the European and American differences, do you see the I guess I'll put it this way, in the experiences that I've had recently, the particularly talking to my friends in Europe since COVID, they were talking about the amount of support, whether it be community support, governmental support, financial support, whatever, for the artistic
Mhm.
community, whether it's music or art, painters or whatever, that they recognize the uh, people who create art as culturally important and support them
Right.
as a society, where maybe here the art is viewed more as a commodity than it is as a culturally important thing by the masses and by government and things like that. As an example, a friend of mine living in Berlin during COVID, they received their full salary from the government, including a stipend. And they didn't have to say, okay, here's what I was making as an artist. They were saying, here's what I need to
Right.
live as an artist. And that's what was paid for. So they were encouraged to
Incredible.
continue to be continue to be an artist.
Yeah, I think that it's not that for Americans, art isn't important to people, but for our economic structure, it hasn't been made a priority. And a lot of great cities have become cities with some of the best artists, and the new thriving communities have been driven out rather, just by they don't control the rent. It's they're always trying to find a way to put profit over everything, and it can oftentimes kill the heart of a community.
Right.
And I think the heart is in the art.
I agree. And I think that I don't necessarily think it's that we necessarily in the US pick on art. I feel it feels to me like it's more of a broader just outlook. We have this whole kind of you can't just do something for the sake of the enjoyment of doing it here. It's almost like you have to justify it as a side hustle. Like it can't be I'm an artist because I love the act of making art. And you can, obviously there are people who
Yeah.
do that. You can't do it. But I'm just saying that as a society, it's not the idea of creating art for art's sake isn't encouraged here. It's like the first thing says, if you say, oh, I'm a musician, they say, oh, that's cute. Or they don't think about it as, oh,
What do we
that's
really do?
noble. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your day job? What do you do for work? And they don't look at it as, oh, the creation of art is a noble and important thing. People like you and I think that, but how many times have we had those conversations with people where they're like, oh, you're a DJ, that's cute. Or, oh, you
Oh,
make
that's yeah.
music, oh, that's cute. What do you really do? What's your day job?
Yeah. There's two things. There's the perception of what I do, which people get the perception of what I do by usually the uh, least enjoyable for me aspect of electronic music, or it's those electronic artists that rise all the way to the top that end up in pop, just sound like regular pop music.
Mhm.
And electronic music came from the underground, and that's where my interest is. So yeah, it's interesting that people think what you do is what these top guys are doing. Nothing wrong with that if that's what you're into. But a lot of people who get into it to try to be the top and just figure out what the top people are doing and not using any of their own personality or creates kind of a
Well,
sad state.
I think that this is a good segue into your books because I think that people see the top people, right? They see the famous artist. They don't see the nitty gritty. They only see the person that was the overnight
Yeah.
success. And they don't see the 15 years of work that allowed them to be an overnight success at the end of those 15 years on that one thing that kind of hit for them. And we talk about pop music and commercial electronic music. I think a great example of this is David Guetta. He has this thing like, oh, he's this
His
pop
name did
guy.
pop in my head while we were talking.
He's the pop guy. And you don't realize that he was the top underground house DJ in the gay clubs in France in the 90s, decades before he ever had a hit. And there's this years and years and years of craft mastery that goes into the final product, right? That goes into, oh, he had a hit with the Black Eyed Peas. Okay, cool. But that wasn't a fluke. And now going into your books, what I love about your books is that your books are they're all about the nitty gritty. Yeah, it's cool to be a music producer and a DJ and whatever, and the end result and having a hit song, but there are systems and structures and practice and habits that go into making that happen. You create ends up happening in the end.
It's making music is a lot like hairstyles in a way, but it could take a long time to look like you didn't give a shit about your hairstyle or something like that. And it takes a long time to appear like you don't give a shit in this music game. But there's a lot of work behind the scenes that to look like it's not a big deal to you, or that it's easy. Exactly. It's not easy. With practice, some of your best moments can feel fairly easy, but that one moment has been rehearsed hundreds of times.
Right.
And the thing that an artist needs to understand is that if you're doing this to make more money than you would make at a standard job, this isn't probably for you. You have to make a lot of sacrifices, and especially if you're out of your 20s and getting into your 30s and up, you have to start figuring out what you're doing with your life. And if you stick to it like I did, you're going to go through some stuff and you're going to feel a bit loserish sometimes because of what what your friends around you, your peers around you are succeeding in with going a traditional route. No clear pathway as an artist. There's certainly things you can do, and there's certainly ways that you can keep yourself afloat. I do write a little bit about that, but really my philosophy is if you want to do it, try to do it from the heart. And there might be a balance, a little give and take, a little give them what they want, just to get a little attention. I think there's a lot of people would frown on that, but I understand it completely. Sometimes my favorite bands, their hit song, I hated, but I would have never even heard of the band if that song hadn't done something and allowed me to dive deeper into what they're really about. But yeah, the process of making music is an art form in itself. And it's more, like the book says, it's more of a mental game than it is about all those pretty gadgets behind you in your studio. I know for a fact that you've built a sound, and with hardware, your equipment, when you're a hardware guy, like you've transitioned more into for your live shows, can really become a great aspect of your personality because they become your friends, and the more you explore, the more that they share with you and the deeper that you can get into these tools.
I think it was Tom Hades, Belgian techno producer, performer.
I've heard the name.
I saw an interview with him and I love this thing. And I actually quote him all the time on this, where he said that when he performs live, that performance is a conversation between him and the machines. And he likes the machines to say things that he wouldn't say normally. And then he responds based on what comes out of the machines. And it ends up becoming a back and forth in this kind of beautiful conversation. And you're translating the energy of a crowd live into that conversation. And you're translating for them. and then you're translating what the machine says for them as well. And it's this cool back and forth. It's what I love the most about
Yeah.
live performance.
It's it's understanding your equipment well enough to make happy accidents that will inspire the next move that you
Totally.
make in a live environment.
Totally.
Because I think some of the best performances in this is like a call and response
Mhm.
between the artist and the equipment.
Mhm.
Sometimes the feedback you get as a guitar player, literal feedback, right? Electronic instruments give you feedback. And when you learn these things, you can keep in mind, that's for me. That's my thing. So I'm going to play in this and get it to speak in this way
Mhm.
so I can react to it
Right. You get
in
that
a certain
inspiration that
way.
kind of leads you in a different path than you would
Yeah.
have gone on your own. Right.
Yeah, it's just here's the thing too. Your equipment doesn't make you who you are though, because we are all our own little personal guitar pedals, if you will, our
Right.
own filters. No matter what we sample, no matter what we borrow, no matter what we steal, no matter what piece of equipment we make, we have a personal filter that everything has to go through.
Mhm.
And it has to get our approval before we nod and go, yeah, that's the sound.
It sounds like you've read favorite books, which is Steal Like an Artist. Have you ever read that?
I have read that.
That's I
Absolutely.
love that idea that every piece of art in any genre of art creation is the sum total of the life experiences of that person who made it. And so you stole little bits, whether you knew it, from everything you ever saw, everything you ever ate, everywhere you
Yeah.
ever traveled, everything you ever listened to. You stole those little nuggets subconsciously, and that becomes your unique individual art.
Have you ever seen an artist that makes collage art?
Mhm. Yeah.
And even though all the sources and all the stuff in each piece is from different places, you once again, you stack up a whole body of work and you go, "Okay, yeah, I see the artist in
Yeah.
this."
It's like a music,
No longer
like
Yeah,
you're
that's
using
what I mean.
music other people. You listen to Daft Punk. Very little that they ever produced and ever released was made by them, other than the fact that it was all made by them. It was just I sample this and I put it together in a way that's unique to me. And now I have this body of work that, you know, even when you listen to tracks that aren't released as Daft Punk tracks, but that have members, one of the two guys in Daft Punk as part of them. Like I was listening the other day to The Music Sounds Better With You, which was Thomas Bangalter was one of the people who produced that track. And you listen to it and you're like, I hear Daft Punk in that, or at least his part of Daft Punk in that track, even though it wasn't a Daft Punk track.
Yeah, it's just like walking in if you're familiar with, a certain DJ or something, you can
Mm.
walk into a club and without even knowing who's playing, you're
Yep,
like, "I know who's playing." And
exactly.
he's playing someone else's track. But for some reason, you can catch the vibe almost right away by what time it is
Mhm.
of night, the mood at a certain time, the texture of the sound, the type of things that the elements of songs that this DJ prefers.
Yeah, purposeful moves
You
that
can
they
pick,
make.
and that's the thing is, as an artist, it can seem like you're cheating, but you don't realize that most of your decisions are intuitive.
Mhm.
So just because it's simple, sometimes the very first thing that you pick or the very randomly it seems, sometimes you can't do better than that first thing. Sometimes you're putting an idea together and you think that you're just pulling the first thing that sounds good to you.
Right.
But then
But that's the
you're
most
thinking,
intuitively
later I'll
you.
fix
Right.
yeah, later I'll fix it later. I just want to get something going. And then once you get it going, all of a sudden you realize that changing it, taking an element out actually does a disservice
Right.
to it.
Well, you just hit on
Um,
something there, the idea of getting going. There's two things from your mental game book, which I
okay.
constantly quote. And I always tell people to buy the book as soon as I quote it, because I'm like, I wouldn't have thought about this in this way had I not read your book. But
Thank you.
the two things for me that I pulled out as the most important kind of bits of advice personally for producing music out of that book were, the first one was, make a lot of music because you get better at it and you suck at the beginning and you have to get through sucking in order to make something that is what you want to make in the end. And the other part,
Yeah.
which I really love, and the one that I probably quote more, and I'd love to hear more about this from you, is the idea that if you want to get good at completing tracks, you have to practice completing tracks. And what we tend to get good
Yeah.
at is starting tracks and then abandoning them. So we become experts in starting and abandoning tracks and then we wonder why we can't finish. And it's because, you know what? Finishing doesn't happen by itself. You have to practice it. You have to get good at finishing tracks.
Yeah. Anything that you do as a
Mhm.
practice is basically, and the things that you don't do as a practice as well. And the points at which your frustration level in the process hits its limit is where your brain will cut off every time until you consciously push yourself beyond that threshold. And the most important thing to understand is that your biggest meltdowns and breakdowns in this process are the catalysts for your greatest flow moments. Usually that flow and those really big discoveries and aha moments usually come after you've had a creative meltdown. And usually what it is because you're presenting yourself with a problem that you're not allowing yourself to give up on.
Mhm.
And usually during that process, you will feel like you hit a wall, but your brain still chews on that. So my grandfather used to always tell me, if you have a problem, think about the problem and sleep on it. And you'll wake up with an answer in the morning. And I think that's true. If you tell your brain that I'm not going to stop this process, then it has to figure out a way through.
Mhm.
And when you figure out a way through the first time, the second time, the third time, then your brain goes, oh, we're at this point where we normally stop, but we've made it through. I know what comes next now. So because of that, you can push yourself further through the process and through the finishing line. When you
Learning
get
how to do
busy,
things by doing things. The act of doing it
literally,
is how you
literally
learn how to do it.
thing. And it's a really great way to start to build your confidence. And everyone is going to do it to a certain extent. But if you constantly look over your shoulder for every move that you're going to make, you'll never gain enough confidence because you're searching outside yourself for the answer. So you
Right.
have to, at some point, put the what would this other person do in this situation down and lift up the new idea of what would I do in this situation? And a lot of people, as artists, never ask themselves that simple question of what would I do in this situation?
Yeah. I've always loved the
And you'd be
phrase. I've always
surprised.
loved the phrase, be yourself because everyone else is taken.
Yeah. You'd be surprised at what you will come up with when you stop giving yourself an out.
Yeah. I think that's profound. Thinking about in the hardware side of things that I've been so into lately, the
Yeah.
idea that the problems that are posed by not having a quick fix in a DAW when you're making music is it forces the practice of creativity. It forces the practice of problem solving and it forces the practice of looking at different and unique and novel ways of doing things that you wouldn't necessarily do if you just had an easy answer right at your fingertips. And it's, oh, I need this sound, but I don't have it. I was thinking about this the other day. I was messing around with my modular case, and I usually use a separate machine for drums, and I have voices in my modular, but I do have a kick drum in there. And I was just messing around with some sound design, and I was like, oh, I wish I could hear this with a hi-hat, but I don't have a hi-hat because I'm not using that machine. I don't have it connected right now. And then I was like, I can make a hat with this other synth. And it forced me to make that. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, wow, now I hadn't really been using that way, but now I have this whole other palette of things I can do with that module, with that voice, because I had this
Yeah.
blockage that I had to think my way through.
It's funny because now that we have the ability to access anything that we want, it's surprising that innovation comes a lot more slowly. It's not actually surprising if you realize that we all know the settings that this and the synth and the effects and the process that this person uses now to get this exact sound. We've lost the idea of failing at something with because we have limited access to the tools
Right.
that we have access to, that's the real win of originality. I have this idea, it might not be true, but I have this idea of the electric piano actually being a failed attempt at literally making an electronic version that sounds exactly like a piano,
Oh, you
right?
just reminded me of my favorite story in electronic music history. The biggest failure as a device of what it was supposed to be originally is the
Know what you're gonna
808.
say.
Is the 808. It was supposed to sound like a bass player and it didn't. It was awful. So no
No,
band
the
wanted
303.
sorry, 303,
The
exactly.
303.
303. It was
Yeah.
supposed to sound like a bass player. And because it didn't, it failed miserably because everyone's, I'm not going to use that with my band. Why would I ever use it? And it ended up,
Ever
it's
since
lived
this
on
thing
for
crap.
40 years and become iconic because it
Yeah.
failed.
And not only is it iconic, but for some strange reason, no one can quite improve on it for
Exactly.
what it does really well. That's the strangest aspect of it,
Yep.
is something that wasn't even meant to do that is now something that is the only tool, not the only tool, but the
Yep.
best, most authentic version of that type of sound
Yep.
is incredible. So I really like the idea of creating limitations.
Yep. I
When
think,
you can
go
create
ahead.
limitations in a world where you have all the options and all the answers, if you can try to kill off the options of searching for all the answers and try at least give it a shot yourself. And here's the thing is you're probably going to fail at it,
Mhm.
but your failure might actually end up being something better. The only reason you think the other thing's better is because you've heard it before. If people hear your thing enough, they're gonna be think of all the artists that are trying to go back and get that lo-fi sound. You know, at the
Right.
time everyone was making that lo-fi sound, they were like, "God, I wish we had more pristine quality in our
Right.
music.
Lo-fi used to crappy.
I wish we were able to fix all of our mistakes, and I wish the drums were perfectly on time." All these things that we wished for, we have it now, and it's not better.
Right.
In fact, it's worse. Those limitations are important, and the repetition of failures is usually the birth of a new success or a new sound.
I think that's awesome. I think that's actually an awesome place for us to end. I think that's a great, profound words. I think that it'll inspire a bunch of people. I would recommend that everybody reads Jason's books. The Mental Game it had a real impact on me, even as somebody who's produced music for a while. It was, everybody can learn something valuable from it because it's not your typical user manual for the software. It's the user's manual for your head in the process of using the software, which I think is really interesting.
Right.
And I think everybody can benefit from it. Thanks so much, Jason. I appreciate it. It's great to have you here. Where can everybody find you? I know you teach courses. People can sign up for those. You teach Ableton courses. You're an Ableton instructor. They can buy your book on Amazon. So where can they find all that stuff from you?
Yeah, they could just go to musicsoftwaretraining.com, and pretty much everything that you would want to find is there. I'm not sure if the book is on there, so you can find the book, The Mental Game, if you just search music production book,
It's
because
the
I'm
book.
lucky enough to have a book that got popular, it'll usually show up in the first 5 results or something like that. It's, once again, a bright yellow with red. So yeah, easy to find. And yeah, you can listen to it on Audible, or you can get the ebook, or you could get the physical book. They're all available there. Yeah,
Audible, I
that
was a little bummed it wasn't you talking to me, but that was okay.
but I was.
You were talking to me through the reader.
Yes,
Awesome.
absolutely.
Well, thank you so
You
much,
didn't know it,
Jason.
but
I appreciate it. And I hope everybody checks out all of Jason's stuff. Thank you guys for tuning in. There's going to be a new one of these podcasts every Tuesday. So make sure you check these out either on YouTube, Spotify video, or where any of those podcasts are available. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And thanks again, Jason
check this
Timothy.
guy out. Keep an eye on this guy right here. He's really doing awesome things.
Appreciate it. And I'll put
Take care,
links to
Eric.
everything in the show notes as well. So everybody can find your information through the show notes. Thanks very much, everybody. And for tuning in. And thanks, Jason Timothy. We'll talk to you soon. Cheers.
Cheers.